You may have noticed this feeling before, a quiet heaviness after certain conversations. Not anger, not sadness, not clear discomfort. Guilt, a strange sense of responsibility that settles inside you, even when you cannot explain what exactly went wrong. You walk away from the interaction and something feels unfinished. You replay the conversation in your mind, what you said, how you said it, how they responded, their tone, their silence, their expression. And slowly questions begin forming. Did I upset them? Did I say too much? Did I sound insensitive? At first, this feels normal because reflection feels responsible. Self-awareness feels mature. You tell yourself that caring about others means caring about their reactions. And for a while, that explanation makes sense. But then you notice something. This guilt does not appear with everyone. It appears after certain conversations, with certain people, in certain emotional patterns. Not every time, not every situation, but often enough that your body begins to recognize it. And this is where confusion begins, because guilt usually follows a clear mistake, a clear action, a clear consequence. But this guilt feels different. It appears without clarity, without an obvious reason, without a moment you can point to and say, "This is where I failed." And when guilt appears without clarity, your mind starts searching for explanations. You examine your tone, your words, your timing, your reaction. You wonder whether you were too direct, too emotional, too honest. And slowly those questions begin shaping how you see yourself. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but quietly. Think about how communication feels when emotional safety is present. You speak naturally. You do not rehearse every sentence. You do not measure every reaction. You do not fear that one wrong word will create distance. But when guilt becomes frequent, communication becomes heavier. You start choosing words carefully. Not because honesty feels wrong, but because reactions feel unpredictable. And unpredictability creates tension. You begin noticing silence differently. A pause feels longer than it should. A short response feels loaded. A distant tone feels like a message. Nothing is openly hostile. Nothing is clearly aggressive. But something feels off. And because it is unclear, you begin taking responsibility for it. You wonder what caused the shift, what you did, what you should have said differently. And guilt begins forming, not because you caused harm, but because uncertainty starts feeling personal. So you apologize, sometimes for your tone, sometimes for your timing, sometimes for emotions that were not wrong to have. You apologize to restore comfort, to remove tension, to prevent distance. And in the moment, it feels necessary, because silence feels threatening, distance feels unsafe, emotional discomfort feels heavy. But repeated apologies create a habit of self-blame, not intentional self-blame, automatic self-blame, the kind that appears before clarity, before reflection, before understanding. Another pattern begins when your emotional reactions start feeling excessive, not because they are excessive, but because someone else responds as if they are. You express discomfort. You explain how something affected you, and instead of acknowledgement, you receive disappointment, not loud criticism, not open rejection, just a sigh, a pause, a look, a quiet withdrawal, and suddenly your attention shifts away from what hurt you and toward how your reaction affected them. You begin wondering if your feelings were too strong, too sensitive, too unnecessary. And that questioning slowly weakens emotional confidence, because the pressure does not look aggressive. It often looks wounded, disappointed, hurt. And when someone appears hurt, your instinct is to repair, to soften. to calm things down. So you adjust yourself. You reduce your reaction. You soften your tone. You explain more than you need to. You become careful. Not because your truth disappeared, but because guilt made your truth feel dangerous. And this is how emotional responsibility begins shifting. Slowly, quietly, without clear recognition. You begin carrying emotional weight that does not belong to you. At first, this feels like empathy, like kindness, like being emotionally mature. But over time, it becomes exhausting because constant responsibility requires constant attention. You monitor your tone, your words, your reactions. You prepare before conversations. You think about what to say, what not to mention, how they might respond. You anticipate silence, disappointment, withdrawal, and anticipation changes behavior. You begin adjusting yourself before conflict even appears. You avoid certain topics. You choose safer words. You reduce emotional honesty. Not because your feelings changed, but because your expectations changed. An expectation reshapes communication. You begin speaking less freely, less openly, less confidently. And this is how guilt becomes a pattern, not a passing emotion, a pattern, one that quietly influences how you think, how you speak, and how much of yourself you allow to be seen. So it is important to understand this. Guilt is not always a signal of wrongdoing. Sometimes it is a signal of pressure, emotional pressure, the kind that does not sound hostile, the kind that does not look aggressive, the kind that feels subtle enough to seem reasonable. And when guilt appears without clear reason, when apologies become automatic, when honesty begins to feel risky, that is often a sign that emotional responsibility has already shifted beneath the surface. Another important pattern appears when conversations leave you with more questions than answers. You begin a conversation feeling clear. You know what bothered you. You know what you want to explain. You speak calmly, carefully, honestly. But by the end, you feel less certain than before, not because new information appeared, but because the conversation moved in a way that made your clarity unstable. You bring up something specific, something that hurt you, something that confused you. But instead of staying with that concern, the focus shifts. Your tone becomes the issue. Your timing becomes the problem. Your reaction becomes the center of the conversation, and the original concern quietly disappears. At first, this feels confusing. You may think you explained it badly. Maybe you chose the wrong words. Maybe you reacted too strongly. Maybe if you communicated better, the outcome would feel different. But when this pattern repeats, confusion becomes doubt. Quiet doubt. The kind that settles inside you and changes how you trust yourself. Another pattern appears when your memory starts feeling less reliable. You remember something clearly, a conversation, a promise, a reaction. But later, when it is discussed again, the version you hear sounds different. Not completely different, just different enough to make you hesitate. They speak calmly, confidently, reasonably, and their confidence makes your memory feel uncertain. You begin asking yourself, did I misunderstand? Did I exaggerate? Did I react too strongly? And slowly, repeated contradiction weakens trust in your own perception, not because your memory is useless, not because you are careless, but because confidence can be worn down gradually. Another shift happens when your emotions are minimized. You express discomfort, concern, confusion, and the response sounds calm, logical, reasonable. but something about it makes your feelings feel smaller, less important, less valid, less necessary. And once your emotions begin feeling smaller, expression becomes harder. You hesitate before speaking, before sharing discomfort, before explaining your reaction, not because your feelings changed, but because expressing them now feels risky. Then reassurance becomes inconsistent. Sometimes there is warmth, understanding, validation. Other times, similar situations receive distance, coldness, silence, a reaction that feels heavier than expected. An inconsistency creates mental effort. You start asking, what changed? What did I do differently? What triggered this? You begin studying the other person's reactions. You learn patterns. You try to predict outcomes. And over time, your behavior begins reflecting anticipation rather than confidence. Even simple decisions can begin feeling harder. You double-check your thoughts. You reconsider your reactions. You look for reassurance before trusting yourself. And this matters because independence depends on trust. Trust in your thinking. Trust in your interpretation. Trust in your emotional signals. When that trust weakens, certainty becomes fragile. Your internal dialogue changes. Instead of trusting your first reaction, you question it immediately. Instead of believing your perception, you search for alternative explanations. Maybe I misunderstood. Maybe I was too sensitive. Maybe my feelings were unnecessary. And this questioning becomes routine. Not because your perception is unreliable, but because repeated doubt trains your mind to distrust its own signals. One of the clearest signs is that clarity returns after distance. After the conversation ends, after the pressure fades, after you are alone again, suddenly your thoughts feel clearer. You understand what bothered you. You notice what was redirected. You see what you could not see while you were inside the interaction. And this matters, because confusion that disappears with distance often reveals pressure that existed in the moment. Pressure that made thinking harder. Pressure that made guilt feel real. Pressure that made responsibility feel personal. And when these patterns connect, when concerns are redirected, when memory feels unstable, when emotions are minimized, when reassurance is inconsistent, when decisions feel harder, when clarity returns only after distance, something becomes visible. Self-doubt is not forming randomly. It is forming through repeated interaction, through repeated confusion, through repeated moments where your confidence is quietly weakened. And once you see that, awareness begins. Not dramatic awareness, not sudden realization, quiet recognition. The kind that appears slowly, but stays once it arrives. You begin noticing interactions differently. You stop reacting immediately. You observe more
Хай
carefully.
виберу цей конверт.
You notice when a
Читаю
conversation
листа. Моя
feels
люба,
heavier
коли я
than it
думаю
should.
про тебе, моє серце.
You
О,
notice when
як
guilt
мило!
appears too quickly. You notice when your first instinct is to apologize before you even understand what happened. And this awareness matters, because awareness is the beginning of clarity. Not forced clarity, natural clarity. The kind that develops when patterns are finally seen. You begin remembering situations that once felt confusing, but now feel more understandable. Moments where you questioned yourself immediately. Moments where your confidence faded. Moments where someone else's reaction made your own perception feel uncertain. And slowly these moments begin forming a pattern. You see how often you adjusted your thinking to match someone else's version of events. How often you explained your reactions instead of standing by them. How often you carried guilt simply because someone else seemed uncomfortable. And that realization can feel uncomfortable, not because you failed, But because awareness changes the meaning of your behavior, you begin to understand that guilt did not grow on its own. It developed through repeated interactions that weakened your trust in yourself. And once that understanding appears, your attention shifts. You begin paying attention to your own reactions again, not dismissing them, not questioning them immediately, but observing them. You notice when confusion appears. You notice when hesitation follows certain conversations. You notice when your thoughts feel clear until someone else reacts. And that observation creates space. Space between the interaction and the self-doubt. Space between guilt and responsibility. Space between someone else's reaction and your automatic apology. And that space is powerful because guilt often moves quickly. It rushes in before clarity. But when you pause, you can ask better questions. Not, what did I do wrong, but what actually happened? Not, why am I too sensitive? But what made me feel this way? Not, how do I fix their reaction? But what responsibility truly belongs to me? These questions change the direction of your thinking. Instead of turning everything inward, you begin examining the situation more clearly. You separate your reaction from the pressure around it, and that separation creates clarity. Gradual clarity, steady clarity, the kind that grows through repetition. Another important shift begins when you start trusting your first reactions again. Not blindly, not impulsively, but respectfully. Your first reaction may not always be complete, but it often contains information. Discomfort is information. Hesitation is information. Tension is information. You do not have to obey every feeling immediately, but you also do not have to dismiss it just because someone else dislikes it. You can listen. You can pause. You can understand. And once you begin doing that, your responses change naturally. You express yourself with less excessive explanation. You apologize less automatically. You stop shrinking your reaction just to keep the peace. Not aggressively, calmly. You begin stating your thoughts with more certainty, not because you need to overpower anyone, but because you are reconnecting with your own perception. And that connection becomes the foundation of confidence, not loud confidence, quiet confidence, the kind that does not depend on approval, the kind that comes from knowing your thoughts deserve consideration. You also begin to understand that confusion does not always mean you are wrong. Sometimes confusion means information is incomplete. Sometimes it means the conversation was redirected. Sometimes it means pressure was present in a way that was hard to recognize immediately. And when you understand this, you stop rushing to doubt yourself. You give yourself time. You let the moment settle. You allow patterns to reveal themselves, because patterns rarely appear in one conversation. They appear through repetition, through familiar emotional outcomes, through the same heaviness returning again and again. And once patterns become visible, your internal voice becomes clearer. You begin recognizing when your reaction feels justified, when your memory feels stable, when your concern still makes sense after the pressure fades. That recognition rebuilds self-trust, and self-trust changes behavior. You speak without rehearsing every word. You respond without second-guessing every thought. You make decisions without needing constant reassurance. Not perfectly, not always easily, but more naturally than before. And perhaps the most important shift happens when you stop seeing guilt as proof. Proof that you were wrong. Proof that you hurt someone. Proof that you must repair something immediately. Instead, you begin seeing guilt as information, a signal. Sometimes guilt points to responsibility, but sometimes it points to imbalance. Sometimes it reveals that you have been carrying feelings that were never yours to hold. And when that becomes clear, you begin returning to yourself, to your perception, to your emotional clarity. This does not mean you stop caring about others. It does not mean you become cold. It does not mean you refuse responsibility. It means you stop accepting responsibility automatically. You pause before apologizing. You reflect before accepting blame. You observe before reacting. You allow silence without filling it immediately. You allow discomfort without rushing to fix it. You allow other people to have reactions without assuming those reactions belong to you. And this is where emotional balance begins returning. Gradually, quietly, through repeated moments where you choose observation instead of automatic guilt. You start trusting your memory again. Carefully, you start trusting your reactions again. Respectfully, you start trusting your perception again. Not because it is always perfect, but because it deserves to be heard. And that trust creates internal stability, a quiet certainty, the kind that remains even when someone else responds unpredictably. You begin noticing something important. Not every silence requires apology. Not every emotional shift requires repair. Not every uncomfortable reaction is your responsibility. Some reactions belong to others. Some emotions belong to them, not to you. And understanding that difference creates freedom. Not freedom from relationships, freedom inside relationships, freedom to speak honestly, freedom to exist without constantly managing the emotional atmosphere, freedom to care without carrying everything. Because guilt is not always empathy. Sometimes it is conditioning that taught you to repair quickly, to soften immediately, to assume responsibility before understanding what happened. And once you recognize that conditioning, you can interrupt it gently. You pause, you breathe, you ask yourself what is actually yours. And with repetition, these pauses become powerful. They rebuild trust. They restore clarity. They remind you that your perception is not something to abandon at the first sign of someone else's discomfort. Over time, your internal voice changes, not louder, clearer, more steady, more reliable. You begin recognizing when your emotions are reasonable, when your concern makes sense, when your reaction deserves respect. And that recognition builds something deeper than confidence. Trust. Trust in your awareness, trust in your thinking, trust in your emotional responses, and trust changes everything. You begin speaking with less hesitation, responding with less apology, expressing yourself without shrinking every thought. Not because conflict disappears, but because self-trust becomes stronger than guilt, stronger than doubt, stronger than the pressure to abandon yourself. And maybe the most powerful change is this: you stop obeying guilt immediately. You examine it, you question it, you understand it, because guilt is not always truth. Sometimes it is habit, sometimes it is pressure, sometimes it is the echo of repeated interactions that trained you to feel responsible for emotions that were never yours. And once you begin examining guilt instead of obeying it, you begin reclaiming your clarity, quietly, moment by moment. You stop reacting automatically. You begin observing first. You stop assuming guilt. You begin understanding responsibility. You stop shrinking your reactions. You begin honoring them. And that shift creates emotional stability, not because misunderstandings stop, not because every relationship becomes easy, but because your perception becomes stronger than the doubts surrounding it. So, if any part of this felt familiar, even slightly, do not ignore that recognition. Do not dismiss the moments where your confidence felt uncertain. Do not minimize the patterns that made your thoughts feel less stable than before, because repeated guilt is never meaningless. It carries information. And once you begin noticing the pattern, once you begin pausing before accepting blame, once you begin trusting your perception again, something changes. You think more clearly. You speak more honestly. You respond more intentionally. And slowly, guilt begins losing its power. Because guilt grows in uncertainty, but confidence grows in understanding. And once understanding becomes stronger than confusion, you begin returning to something that may have felt distant for a long time: your trust in yourself.